Hi guys, Miss Francis here to wrap up our unit on evolution. We're going to discuss the origin of life, in other words, the heterotroph hypothesis. Now, the origin of life is one of the most controversial topics. Where did we come from? Religious people sometimes believe that ultimately we were all created by God. The scientific community proposes an alternative theory to that maybe God guided evolution, but that it was scientific processes that actually caused evolution. I'm going to give you the scientific perspective on evolution. So, how did the world go from a hostile environment to the world that we live in today? Well, if we were to travel back in time, get in a time machine, and see what it was like when Earth first formed, it was inhospitable. Nothing would be able to survive. There were gases that came from the molten interior of the planet. These included carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, nitrogen, water vapor, sulfur, hydrogen chloride, methane, but there was no oxygen. There was oxygen inside of other molecules, for example, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and water, but there was no oxygen by itself. Now, how do we know about these primordial gases? We actually studied the bubbles of gases that were trapped in glacial cores. So, if there was no oxygen, there's no way there could be an ozone layer. The ozone layer is what protects us from harmful UV rays. So the Earth was extremely, extremely hot. Now, over time, the Earth cooled. The gases condensed and there was precipitation for hundreds of thousands of years. With that precipitation, it brought down the condensed gases, which are now in the form of those inorganic molecules. But now, due to the properties of water and energy sources, an organic soup was formed, where the inorganic molecules were rearranged to form amino acids, to form carbohydrates. But in order to do that, to do dehydration synthesis, the process by which these monomers were formed, you needed energy. So where did this energy come from? Came from UV, from lightning, radioactivity, energy from volcanoes. So like I said, what molecules were formed? Amino acids would later serve as building blocks for proteins. You've got glycerol forming, amino acids forming, glucose forming, but at this point there is still no life. Separately, two scientists, Oparin and Haldane, theorized that organic molecules could only form if oxygen was not present. And they said this was because oxygen is too reactive, that it would have prevented most molecules from forming. So along comes Stanley Miller. Stanley Miller was a scientist that wanted to test the theory of Oparin and Haldane within a lab setting. So what he did was simulate the primordial conditions in the lab. In other words, he created a closed system that contained all the gases that would have been present during the time of primordial Earth. He applied electric sparks to these gases without oxygen that were in a flask within this closed system, and after a week, the water contained various organic molecules such as amino acids. So Stanley Miller did provide evidence that Oparin and Haldane were correct in that these inorganic molecules reorganized themselves into organic molecules such as monomers. Now, these monomers then combine to form polymers. So my amino acids join to form proteins, my glucose join to form carbohydrates, and then about 3.5 billion years ago, we think that the first precursor to cells was created, and these are called protobionts. One of the polymers that was formed via dehydration synthesis were lipids. The lipids were attracted to one another and might have formed a membrane, which then provided a separation from the primordial sea. So with that self-enclosed area, now reactions can occur and materials could be exchanged. So now here comes our first life, the primitive heterotrophic prokaryote. Could they make their own food? In other words, were they photosynthetic? No, they did not have chloroplasts. Well, then what was their food source? Their food source was organic molecules like proteins, lipids, and glucose that came from the sea. These organisms reproduced asexually via binary fission. There was also horizontal transfer occurring at this time. These organisms did anaerobic respiration. They did glycolysis to make ATP. But these heterotrophic prokaryotes eventually didn't have enough nutrients to survive because the environment couldn't sustain enough nutrients. And eventually, through probably some sort of mutation, you've got your primitive autotrophic prokaryote formed. These are the first organisms to make their own food. However, were they photosynthetic? No. They were what we called chemosynthetic. They did chemosynthesis. In other words, they made food via hydrogen sulfide that came from the underwater volcanic gases. Now, eventually, over time, the bacteria start to move upwards towards the surface, and maybe through another mutation, you have cyanobacteria using light for food production. They're doing cyclic photophosphorylation. Then eventually, through probably another sort of mutation, you've got photosynthetic organisms doing non-cyclic photophosphorylation. Now, this is huge because from non-cyclic photophosphorylation, you get oxygen released into the atmosphere. So now ozone could be formed. You could have an ozone layer, which formed a protective layer against UV rays, which then enabled aquatic organisms to move to the land. It allowed for a terrestrial existence. Furthermore, the presence of oxygen allowed for aerobic respiration to evolve. And we know from aerobic respiration, we get a lot of ATP, or a lot more ATP than is produced through anaerobic respiration. So this increase in energy production means that organisms could get larger. And you've also got the potential for eukaryotes to form. This is where the endosymbiotic theory plays a role, that the mitochondria and chloroplasts that were once prokaryotes took up residence inside of other cells to become the first eukaryotic cells. So what did this non-cyclic photophosphorylation bring about changes in? Well, number one, it enabled oxygen to be released, which means that organisms can do aerobic respiration instead of anaerobic respiration. It means that larger organisms can evolve as well. And now you have the introduction of sexual reproduction, where even more diversity is created, which again means a greater chance for survival.